Hi, so my chosen book review is on the book Religious Experience and Journal of Miss Jarena Lee, giving an account of her call to preach the gospel. And I really enjoyed the book. I enjoyed hearing about Miss Lee's call to ministry, her journeys, and it was just a brief journey of her childhood, her early marriage, her why she was called, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But then, really, when during her experiences, during her call to spread the gospel, was really fascinating. How she interpreted the people that she went to speak, how she thought of all of that, and so I really, it was a fascinating book to read. And so the book is an autobiography. It was first published in 1836. Miss Lee gives just a brief description of her childhood, when she was introduced to Jesus, and then also feeling the call to be able to spread the gospel, which happened in about her 20s. She also speaks briefly of her marriage until he dies, leaving her with two young children. And so at this point, Miss Lee begins to journal her experience by giving a really detailed account of her preaching the gospel in the northeastern states. She talks about the miles that she walked, how many times she preached during that period of time. She was really very specific. Miss Jarena Lee was born on February 11, 1783 in Cape May, New Jersey, which I found was really fascinating because I have family in that area. And so that kind of hit home a little bit. The book does not state, and I could not find any information on the internet about when she died. However, what the closest that I could figure out was it was sometime early in 1864. The knowledge that I found was that she kind of went off on her own and lived the remaining years quietly. So we picture that she probably died when she was about 81 years old. The thesis of this autobiography was completely to give an accurate account of Miss Jarena Lee's passion to preach the good news of the Gospels. And she had suffered such a deep depression that almost led to suicide 4 different times. And she was saved by what she says was the hand of God. And so because she was saved, she felt like she had a reason, a purpose to be here, and that God had given her this purpose. And her calling was to devote the rest of her life to her Savior. Her saving poem was beautiful. The more I strove against its power, I felt its weight and guilt the more. Till late I heard my Savior say, "Come hither, soul, I am the way." Miss Lee was the first female preacher of the First African Methodist Episcopal Church. And then as a side note, I also learned that she was the very first African American woman to publish an autobiography in the United States. When Miss Lee had received the call to preach, she went to Richard Allen, who was the founder of the United African Methodist Episcopal Church. However, Allen would not appoint her because there was no provision for women preachers at that time. And so Lee decided that she would just speak to people on her own. And that is exactly what she did. She began to go into homes, go into groups of people, have small gatherings, and she decided nobody was going to stop her from preaching. Her philosophy that she explains on page 15 was kind of neat. If the man may preach because the Savior died for him, why not the woman, seeing he died for her also? Is he not a whole Savior instead of half a one? So that was fascinating. After 8 years, Richard Allen finally decided to let her preach. And so she had been out in a congregation, and the man who was scheduled to preach that day fell ill and ended up not being able to do so. And so without even thinking about it, Jarena Lee stood up and she began to preach. And Richard Allen, who was the founder of the United African Methodist Episcopal Church, happened to be in the congregation that day and heard her preach. And he decided that she did just a fantastic job, that he started to appoint her to places to share the gospel. She would preach to both women and men, blacks and whites. It didn't matter to her. Her job was to spread the gospel. Most places, it seemed like she was well received. Most people took care of her. They welcomed her into their homes. They would transport her as far as they could, and then she would walk the rest of the way. However, there were some places that did not accept her. One, because she was African American, and then as the second one, because she was a woman. And it was interesting because she was very specific. Sometimes it was because I was an African American, they would not allow me to preach. Or other times it was because I was a woman. And then there were other places, yet still, I was an African American woman. And so it was interesting to see the different towns that had issues with the different things. Some were fine with her being a woman, but not being African American. Some were fine with her being African American, but not a woman. And then some just didn't like her altogether. And so that was really an interesting thing that I discovered through her reading. So despite her struggles and the abuse for being a woman and being black, she still continued on her calling with the protection of God and those that believed in her. And Richard Allen really began to respect her after, hearing her several times. She had a passion for saving others through the conviction of Christ. I believe that this book is really important to present-day clergy and laity in the United Methodist Church because it shows that despite knowledge, despite education, God's going to equip those that he wants called into ministry. Despite difficulties, despite prejudice, despite sickness, despite life events, all of those are always going to be present. But the Lord is always going to protect, and he's going to guide those that are called into ministry. And there's not going to be a whole lot that's going to be able to stop that. And that came very clear through Jarena Lee. In Jarena Lee's words, the Lord's will be done. It is crucial for modern-day laity and clergy to hear from people of the past, to learn from their successes and their failures, and so that we can learn from those. Seeing Jarena Lee following her passion, to me, is a motivation to keep spreading the gospel despite difficulties of other people and life events. There were many times that Miss Lee was met with a lot of opposition. She wanted to withdraw from the United Methodist Church. And that also spoke to me because in ministry, and I've been doing ministry for 15 years now, and there has been so many times that I've been attacked, or it's been frustrating, or there's loopholes to go through. And boy, I've been ready just to throw down the towel and say, I'm done. The United Methodist Church just, I just can't make any progress. I can't. There's too many blockades, and that frustration definitely beats through. But it's motivating to read her to say, but she picked herself back up and she continued on. This was where she was called to be, and so she realized that the oppositions were all a test of her faithfulness to God, and that speaks loudly to me that when we are presented these oppositions, these frustrations, that we are being tested and that we need to remain faithful. God put us in the position that we are in for a reason, and that's what we need to keep on doing. We just need to take a deep breath, pray, and go back to doing our ministry. Miss Lee allowed God to speak through her, and she said that often throughout her journal. And then she always gave God the credit for whatever she said. Her exact words in her journal would be, "The Spirit of God came upon me, and I spoke without fear of man." She spoke without fear of man. Um, that was just another powerful statement to me. That she was not going to let people, humans, get in her way. She'd been called by God, and her honor, her devotion was to fulfill God's promise, and that's what she was going to do. I was impressed with how Miss Lee preached with with conviction, no matter who she was talking with. She was an extreme advocate for teaching children about the love of Christ. I had to stop and find this page in my book because it just came to me. And it's a story about a little girl about 8 or 9 of age. And she experienced religion and prayed in public and attended to their private devotions so much for early piety. Teach the child the way he should go, and when he gets old he will not depart from it. But it is to be lamented that so few of our children experience this early piety. The cause we must try to find out and avoid the evil effects, and not bring up our children in so much pride and heathenism. We, as a people, are generally poor and cannot support so many changes of fashion. They grow up and they crave it, and of times substitute evil practices to support them, either girls or boys, and often bring a stigma upon their parents and family connections, though very respectable. Let us bring up our children in industry, for work is honorable, and it is the way to get riches and to keep them. And so, she loved children. She had 2 of her own, and she left those 2 children behind with caretakers to raise them while she traveled to share the gospel. And I think it's fascinating that she recognized that we don't teach our children how to pray and how to share the gospel, how to rely on God's will, and then we expect them to know that in adulthood. I find the same thing is very much true today. We don't require our children to go to Sunday school. We don't require them to be active in church. We allow sports and dance and academic clubs to take precedence over their spiritual education. And I think her words speak very much true today. Raise your children up in the Lord now, so that they will not stray when they're adults. Another group that she often spoke to were other minorities. For example, she went up to the Native American community that was up towards like Buffalo, New York, Niagara, New York, and she spoke to the Native Americans. Of course, she had an interpreter, but they welcomed her just with open arms, and so she shared her love of the Lord with them, and they willingly accepted her. And so I think, in conclusion, with this book, it's such an important book for us to see somebody who was not supposed to, according to our rules as people, be open to sharing the gospel. And so I think with Jarena Lee, she was called to share. She was in a time when African Americans were slaves. They were maids, they were butlers, they were gardeners. They worked for whites. And that wasn't good enough for her. She wanted to share the love of the Lord that saved her life. And And I value that. I value that she was brave and courageous enough to say, this is what I'm going to do. And even the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church could not stop her. She was going to